Welcome to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement, a podcast where we dive into the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the law enforcement officer.
Minor injury accident in the 2700 block of 156th Avenue Northeast.
Welcome back to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement. I'm your host, Vernon Phillips, and today we got a special guest on the show. We've got retired ATF Deputy Assistant Director Peter Forcelli. Actually, I think I butchered your last name.
Forcelli.
But as we get started, why don't we just jump right in? You tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your history in law enforcement, and we'll go from there.
Sure. I started my law enforcement career back in New York in the day. There were three different police departments, or three big ones. There's New York City Housing Authority, the Transit Authority, and the NYPD. We all took the same test, went through the same academy. So I took the test to be a New York City cop. Was 16 and a half when I took the written test. You were allowed to back then at that age, believe it or not. And I got hired.
16 and a half.
Yeah, I was in 10th grade. So I passed it, and I started my career at age 20 because you could be 20 back then and get sworn in. Funny, because that same year you couldn't drink until you were 21. So anyway, but when I started the job, I found out I was going to the Housing Authority Police Department. And initially I was a little bit disappointed. I wanted to be an NYPD cop, but it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because it was a real small department, great mission, patrol in the projects, a lot of violent crime in the projects, a lot of drug activity in the projects. So worked with some really good people. Then in 1994, I went to the Detective Bureau, still in the Housing Authority Police Department. And then Giuliani came in 95 and merged all three police departments together. So I wound up staying in the Detective Bureau, but in a regular precinct detective squad for a little while. And then in 1996, almost 1997, I went into the Homicide Task Force. So I was working on homicide cases, and then it was around this time that New York City decided to finally acknowledge that they had a gang problem, which they had, but they were denying it for the longest time because they were afraid it would affect tourism. So they started a federal task force to work on cases that were homicide related that the Bronx District Attorney's Office really didn't have a handle on, prosecuting. So we started working federal cases as a detective. Did that for about 5 years. Really liked working federal cases because the criminal justice system is, in my opinion, more effective because people go to jail and stay there, unlike Rikers Island in New York City. So, after 15 years with the NYPD, I jumped ship and became an ATF agent in New York. Worked there for about 6 years as an agent, field agent. Went to Phoenix as a first line supervisor. Then after that, spent some time up in Canada as a liaison and headquarters, a couple tours through headquarters. And then I was down in Florida as the assistant special agent in charge of the Miami Field Division. Then eventually I was the special agent in charge. So I was down there for the Pulse nightclub shooting, Parkland, and the shooting that happened at Fort Lauderdale Airport. So I ran the division. We handled those investigations. Not so much Pulse. The crime scene was in the Tampa Field Division's area, but Omar Mateen lived in our area. So the investigation into how he bought the guns fell under me. And then spent my last 3 years in headquarters, first as the head of investigations for the eastern region of the United States. But then finally, my last 3 years was roughly overseeing hiring, but mostly the academy and all training for ATF, which was nice because I was burnt out by that time.
I can imagine.
Over 30 years,
yeah,
in the profession. And it was nice to see the fresh new faces starting at the academy. I'd get to go down there 1 week a month and greet them and talk to them, have lunch with them. It was nice to see, the folks that hadn't been beaten down by the bureaucracy and the politics and the crap that we see, in our profession.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole lot there to unpack. I mean, you've got quite an extensive history working in law enforcement. It sounds like you've had the opportunity to work a lot of different areas and a lot of different realms and just be a part of a lot of different things. So and there's a couple of different things I want to kind of pull out there and unpack, but as you kind of look back over, your career, your law enforcement career, what was one of the most enjoyable times for you that you just really enjoyed the position you had and what you were doing?
Looking back now at this time, I'm retired. When I was a uniform cop, I couldn't wait to get out of uniform. In New York, we had plainclothes patrol when you did patrol work in civilian clothes. And then obviously the Detective Bureau does investigations. But in hindsight, it was the time on patrol that I think was the most fun, and for a lot of reasons. I mean, you see a lot of different things on patrol. Some of it's funny, some of it's tragic. I mean, but that's where the stories come from. The other thing is, when you're on patrol, you got to build that trust with the community. You're out there talking to people. You're out there, gaining respect, because respect has to be given, in order to be earned, which was nice to get out there. You learn how to talk to people when you're out there on patrol. When you're in the detective bureau, if you catch a crappy case, you go home that night. Tomorrow you come back and on your desk waiting for you is that crappy case. We're on patrol for the most part. If you had a shitty day, you come back the following day, and it's normally a brand new, a clean slate. So I miss that. I enjoyed working cases as a detective. I like putting the puzzle together, but I mean, I wouldn't describe it as fun. It was challenging.
Mhm.
And then finally, when I was in charge of ATF's Miami office, what I liked was being able to help the agents, get the resources that they needed to work their cases. Uh, you know, Leadership is important. I think as long as in that leadership position, you realize that you're serving your folks, they're not serving you. I mean, I always used to say that I don't get to decide whether or not I was a good leader. The only folks that get to make the only folks that get a vote on that is the people who I led. So I just, as I left the profession, I hope I made a good impression on them and made their lives a little easier to live, because I know our profession can be brutal at times.
Yeah, and I think that's it's pretty funny you say that, especially you say, "Hey, I'm working patrol, working, that line level," because a lot of times, like you said, "Hey, I can't wait till I'm not working patrol anymore, or I can't work. I'm not work, in this area, and I'm doing this." But um, oftentimes, you kind of find that sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side, as they say, right?
Yeah.
So, and as you look back over, your extensive career, I mean, we know that law enforcement takes a significant toll on the individual. So when you kind of look back, what was something that you did that you put in place that just helped guard yourself, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually? What are some of the things that you did just to keep yourself, in check throughout the years?
Well, if I'm going to be realistic with you, I'll tell you I did a really bad job at that. I mean, I was always a gym rat. I mean, so I'm not, when I say gym rat, I was never good at cardio. I hated cardio, but I was one of those folks, bench pressing, lifting weights. And, as you get older and your joints get all screwed up, you realize that's not the healthiest thing either. And I remember when I went through the ATF Academy, I was 35 years old. So I'd already had 15 years in law enforcement. Doing those runs kicked my backside, man, because I was a
Yeah.
big dopey weightlifter. But look, realistically speaking, I was raised by old school cops who had this perception as, hey, man, I'm the police. I'm the guy that you come to for help. So I don't ever ask for help. And I'd seen a lot of things over my time on the job, homicides of children. I was a first responder to the Happy Land Social Club fire, which killed 87 people. So seeing something like that takes a toll on you. And I was also a 9/11 first responder, and I wound up, getting lung cancer as a result of my response there back in 2018. So by this time, I had well over 20 years in law enforcement, and I reflected back on the time. Man, the job always came first to me. I didn't want to miss. It's funny. I was talking to a retired NYPD cold case squad commander, a good guy named Tom Joyce, and we talked about how we never took the holidays off. We didn't take the vacations that we should have taken. We didn't spend the time with our family because it's about FOMO. You didn't want to miss out on the big chase or the big arrest or the
Mhm.
big search warrant. So, in the end, it wasn't until I had my right lung removed that I decided, hey, man, I came into this profession whole. It's time for me to leave whole. And I started to do things to better take care of myself. But for a long time, I put the job before me, before family. And I think a lot of cops do that. And I hope now that the tone has kind of changed where there's no stigma anymore for asking for help, I hope cops will take the time to do that. Because look, it takes courage to do it. And I was a coward for a long time where I knew I needed to talk to somebody, but I didn't have the guts to do it until it was almost too late. But luckily, I was able to still keep my family intact, and my kids and wife, everybody, we get along. They understand. In fact, my kids followed me into law enforcement. So, but yeah, I mean, I didn't do as good a job protecting myself as I should have over the years.
Yeah, and I think that's that goes with a lot of us. I mean, even myself. I mean, I've talked about this on the show where I try to teach people how to effectively take care of themselves, and hey, make sure that you're talking about the things that are bothering. Make sure you're watching your stress levels, and you know and on the back end of that, you know, those who help individuals are oftentimes the ones that are notoriously terrible about taking care of themselves. So, so I can definitely relate to that. But you know, and I appreciate I appreciate just your honesty in that. So, what is something that you would encourage those getting into the profession then to do to take care of themselves, or those who are in the profession that maybe still have that mindset that, okay, I don't got to reach out, I don't have to, I don't have to ask for help. What would you encourage them to do?
Well, learn from my mistake. Don't be me. I mean, I spent years where I'd come home from work, just, I'm so caught up in the job. I love the job and I still love the job. I miss it. I'm not in that profession anymore. You feel like you're doing good. But I remember coming home from like a busy day and just sitting there, turning on the TV. My wife and kids would be, there. I'd be watching TV, but not even really watching TV. I was so caught up in my own head that sometimes they'd have to call me like once, twice, three times before I'd snap out of it and realize somebody was trying to talk to me. But, I was staring at the television and not even really watching the television because the job was just like in my head. And it wasn't like tormenting me. I'm just saying I was so caught up in it that I wasn't thinking about other things. So I would say, look, man, it's noble and it's expected of folks to give the job 100% of their effort, but shame on you if you give it 100% of your time, because like in the end, your family is there for you when you retire. All those relationships you build, except for with your closest friends, they kind of end because people go about their lives. So, take care of yourselves and take care of your family. And because look, if you're not taking care of those things, you can't be the most effective law enforcement officer that you could possibly be. So again, I made a mistake that I hope others won't make, and I'm just really happy that the tone is kind of turned where it's no longer stigmatized for folks to do the things they should be doing, which is take care of themselves. If they need to see a doctor, see a doctor. I mentioned the lung cancer. I had a couple doctors prior to that suggest I might have had PTSD, and my responses to them were not very pleasant. I mean, I'm not a rude person. It wasn't like combative, but I was very dismissive. And it was actually a person who teaches meditation, who I met down in Florida, who actually talked me into realizing certain things that led me to actually ask for help. And it's because during the cancer treatment, my blood pressure was astronomical. Wasn't sure if I was going to beat it or not. And I'm many, many years clear now, so I'm fine. I'm not looking for sympathy because I was lucky. But yeah, I mean, it takes those conversations and really listening to people. And then the other thing is just understanding that, you know, it's okay to also ask a colleague, hey, man, are you doing okay? You know what I mean? Because a lot of times people see folks struggling and they're afraid to ask that question. But that question nowadays could be a lifesaver because cops are seeing things
Yeah,
differently than,
absolutely.
yeah. I mean, look, the other thing is I grew up in the profession when, even in places like New York, which was very liberal, even the mayors through my career back then supported the police. They didn't throw you under the bus for political points. When you did something bad, you had to face the music. But nowadays, the public, especially elected officials, aren't as supportive as they used to be. So that's even more reason to not give the job your life. Give them your effort, give 100%, but make some time for yourself because the police department doesn't love you back no matter how much you love the job.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. The fact that you said, "Look, give 100% of your effort." If you're going to do the job. You know, wholeheartedly, all in, but don't give it 100% of your time. And we see that time and time again with people in the profession where it's like the job becomes everything, right? It becomes who they are. It's
Right.
their identity. It consumes their whole entire life. I mean, if you work in law enforcement, generally all your friends are law enforcement, right? And you're surrounded by it all the time. So you oftentimes can't escape it. So every time you go and hang out with your friends, if they're in law enforcement, what do you end up doing? You end up talking shop, right?
Right.
You talk about, different cases, you talk about different situations. Oh, hey, I got into this with this, and you never get that break, you never get that separation. So, it's a relief to hear you say and do I try to encourage others like, hey, look, yeah, give it your all, give it 100% of your effort, but man, don't give it 100% of your time. Make sure that you're building that time in there for your family, right? And you're establishing those relationships outside of the career to give you a break from the career
Right.
because that's that never ending cycle where you're just in it all the time.
Yeah.
So,
But look, there's, as you know, I mean, and I'm glad you're talking about these things. There's chemical stuff that goes in our body when we're at work and we're in these chases and you're all, I mean, you have all of the adrenaline, you're surging through it. And then when you go home, you have the reverse where, you're kind of in that catabolic state because, those chemicals that had you like, all geared up for work or have now left and you're just kind of drained,
mhm.
So, I mean, if you're not doing things to keep you, you know, um, just inspired with stuff outside of work, then you're not going to be that same person when you're home with your family or out with your friends. And you brought up a good point. I was fortunate in that I didn't lose touch with a lot of the kids I grew up with when I became a cop. I used to go out, hang out with them. But I did see a lot of folks, and to a large degree, I spent most of my time off duty with cops, and I love them to death. But that could be toxic to some degree because, to your point, I mean, you're talking about the job, you're talking about how the job screwed you over, about who shouldn't have got promoted. I mean, all of this stuff
Oh man, yeah,
that gets you all fired up. You're talking about during the time where your body should be healing from all this stuff that you deal with at work. Because look, it's a stressful profession, more so now than during my time on the job. I would say, you know.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, because the whole political realm in law enforcement and first responder community now is, I think, is so much more volatile than it was, years ago. And I mean, you look at media and just this whole idea of, they paint law enforcement in such a negative light most of the time. And, everybody's Monday morning quarterback and what you should have done and shouldn't have done. And, and most of them, have no idea, right? And would completely foobar a situation if they were in their shoes, right? If they were in the officer's shoes having to make that decision, they would completely mess it up.
Right.
So it's just it's a different time now, but taking that time and making sure that you're investing in yourself, I think is a big important thing. It's a good takeaway. And I'm glad that you're talking about it, but long career, lots of stuff, but I think probably a lot of times what people want to talk to you about is Operation Fast and Furious, right? And
Yeah.
what that is and what that looks like and kind of all of that. And for those that aren't aware of that, why don't you just kind of, bring us up to speed on what that is?
Sure, sure. Well, before I went out to Phoenix as a group supervisor, I had worked in New York, like I said, and we had a really good relationship with the federal prosecutors. So, I mean, we were taking cases there and we were taking it could be like a felon in possession of a firearm. And we knew that person had a tie to a gang or to a home invasion crew. So, we were taking them into custody with the intent on charging them and then flipping them so that we can develop information and go and build bigger cases. When I got out to Arizona, which is a different U.S. attorney's office, and I've learned that they're not all created equal, so to speak, it was weird. Like the first weekend I was out there, one of my agents called me, and we got a phone call. Well, he got a phone call from a licensed gun dealer who said, "Hey, a guy just came into my shop with a bag full of money, asking to buy 13 AK-47 variant rifles. He's basically asked for everything he had on the shelf." So he made the transaction. Um, Once we were outside and able to conduct a surveillance and then a car stop and then ask some probative questions. And that's how it worked. I mean, invariably, the dealers would call us. We would stop a car. We would catch the people, separate them, catch them in lies, recommend prosecution, and seize the firearms so they won't be used against some cop or some kid or, go to the cartels. And what I noticed was with that car stop and with many others, we were always told, well, hey, let them go and we'll indict it later, which was the complete opposite of what I dealt with in New York, where it would be like, hey, put them in handcuffs, take them to the jail, we'll draw up a complaint, we'll charge them. So the concept of letting folks go,
Mm.
who were, again, they weren't buying guns to go hunt with, they weren't buying guns to sell to hunters, they were buying guns to sell to cartel folks. Letting them go didn't sit well with me, but I'm a brand new supervisor in a different part of the country, and I'm trying to learn from my folks, and I learned that that's the tone. Let them go, and very often there would never be that chance to indict them because the case would either sit, or they wouldn't make a decision, or they would outright decline it. So we had these 5 words that I hated to hear: take it to the county, which meant the U.S. Attorney's Office, which made a lot more money than county prosecutors, was punting. And if there was no underlying state violation, those firearms traffickers or straw purchasers would just remain free. So I watched this happen for a while. Then we had a case where a guy bought a gun, and then 2 days later, that gun was used with several other guns in the town in Mexico called Cananea, where 21 people were killed, 4 of them cops, and 4 other cops were abducted because the cartel, that's how they roll down there, and brought into the desert and tortured and left for dead. And we referred that case for prosecution, got the same answer. Like, no, the gun's in Mexico, the body of the crime's in Mexico, hard pass. Had a couple other cases. One guy trafficked 50 caliber rifles to the Juarez cartel. One of them was used to kill a cop, a police commander, in fact, outside of a daycare center in Juarez, which is, appalling. So we would get confessions and we would get all the evidence and we would take it to the federal prosecutors and always be told no, or rarely would they take the case. But the problem is, like I said, if we couldn't take it to the county, and then we actually forged a relationship with the state attorney general's office, which prior to that didn't do gun cases. They were focused on like Medicare fraud, white collar type crime. So we went to them saying, "Hey, we need your help," and they were all in. They were great. Literally the day of the meeting, when I briefed them on what we wanted to do with them, my question for them was, "Hey, when can we start?" And their answer was right away. But meanwhile, the U.S. Attorney's Office, whose job it was to prosecute the federal crime, kept punting. So anyway, this went on for years. So we seized thousands of guns that were destined for the cartels, took them into our custody. Some people were arrested and charged in the county. Some were arrested and charged in the state. Very few were charged federally. So in late 2009, my group's mission had changed because the Phoenix Field Division the Phoenix area had led the United States in home invasions and kidnappings. And we were second in the hemisphere behind Mexico City, which is not a distinction that a city in the United States wants to have.
No,
so
not
I
at
had,
all.
yeah, exactly. So I had experience working home invasion cases in New York. That's kind of what I specialized in when I became an agent there. And so my mission was changed, as was that of my agents. So they started a brand new group, Phoenix Group 7. I was in Group 1. They sat at an offsite over by DEA, and they were tasked with now being the Mexico-bound firearms trafficking group. So the calls that I talked to you before about from the dealers would happen one of 3 ways. One would be, "Hey, this guy's in here. It's very shady. Can you get out here and we'll, have one of your agents come in, undercover. We'll watch the sale, follow him out, get him out of my parking lot, stop him somewhere down the road." And we did that. Then there were times where they'd call us and we weren't available because we were out on another stop. Usually they came from another dealer. So they'd be like, "Well, we'll just tell the person they didn't pass the background check and to have them come back tomorrow." And then we would go out and do what we would plan on doing the next day. And then there were times where we were just out of pocket because we had a lot going on. And in those instances, the licensed dealers would just say, "All right, we're not going to make the sale." But at no point did they sell the gun and then call us after the fact. I mean, they weren't jeopardizing public safety because if you hear, some folks in the media talk about gun dealers, they're all bad, and that's not true. 90% of the cases that we got came from them because they're honest people and they care about public safety. So anyway, that scenario happened time and time and time again for roughly 3 years while I was a supervisor there. And when we would seize the guns didn't get traced because I don't know if you know how a gun trace works. When a gun is found at a crime scene, it's traced to its first retail purchase. So what happens is the police department here or in Mexico or wherever will call ATF and say, "Hey, we have this gun. Can you trace it for us?" And so ATF people sitting in a building in Martinsburg, West Virginia, will call the manufacturer, Colt, for example, and say, "Hey, can you tell us when this gun was made and where it was shipped?" And this is all done by phone calls. So they'll say, "Yeah, we made that gun, and this date we shipped it to Pete's wholesaler." So then they call Pete. "Pete, can you tell us when did this gun come into your shop and what was the disposition?" Like, "Okay, well we got it on this date, and then we shipped it off to Vernon's gun store in Tucson." So then they'll call Vernon, and Vernon will say, "Well, yeah, I sold it to this date to this person," and that's where the trail basically ends, is with that first retail purchase. So, but because we were seizing those guns and they weren't turning up at crime scenes, there were no traces, right? Because there's no need to trace it. So now all of these dealers who were cooperating with us start getting phone calls saying, "Hey, we're tracing one of your guns was recovered at this crime scene in Mexico or that crime scene in Mexico." So what happened is a lot of the dealers started resisting. They're like, "Hey, man, we don't want to sell these guns to these people anymore." So the ATF folks who were working on that case and the federal prosecutors who were not prosecuting cases prior to this, met with these dealers and encouraged them to continue to sell. Like, hey, we're doing something different. You're good to go. Keep selling. The dealer's like, well, we don't want to. No, we need you. Continue to sell. So the dealers are doing exactly what ATF folks in that group and the prosecutors asked them to do. So what happens in December of 2010 is a Border Patrol agent named Brian Terry is patrolling the border looking for people who are doing drug robberies in the desert. So they're robbing the people who are, bringing the drugs into the United States so they could sell them for entire profit. Dangerous business because you're stealing from the cartels. So these aren't, timid guys. And Brian gets killed. And one of the firearms, at least one, I wasn't in that group, traced back to this Operation Fast and Furious case, which actually was called the Jacob Chambers et al. And others case. Operation Fast and Furious was a nickname the case was given because these guys drove cars that were like the ones used in the movie, small Japanese import cars, all souped up. So what happened at this point was when Brian Terry was killed, an agent who was in that group named John Dodson, who knew what techniques they were using or not using, approached Senator Grassley's office and blew the whistle. So I would sit at these meetings with other group supervisors. We each had to sit down with our chain of command and explain what our teams were working on. And I would listen to, at these meetings, with reference to the Fast and Furious case, their supervisor talk about, well, we have a case with 600 guns. And then it would be 800 and then 900. And I would ask, are we you guys stopping the straw purchasers? Are you, like, what are you doing? And I would always be told, hey, relax, Peter, we're doing something different, groundbreaking stuff. So now at one of those meetings, I am present when the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division says, hey, the U.S. Attorney's Office is really pissed off at John Dodson. We don't walk guns, and we all know that. And, that wasn't true. So don't be surprised if John Dodson doesn't wind up getting indicted. So I'm sitting there and just at this point, I'm seething because for years I was fighting with the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute gun traffickers. People who were giving guns to people who were killing other human beings. And now all of a sudden there's rumblings that they were going to prosecute John Dodson, who was a whistleblower, and I didn't know for what. So I was pretty pissed off. So I went home and told my wife what was going on. And then the following morning we agreed. I called Grassley's office and said, hey, listen, my understanding is that you're being told by the Department of Justice that John Dodson's a liar and that ATF didn't walk guns. I'm here to tell you that they did. Subpoena me, and I'll tell you everything that you want to know. And that's what happened. I mean, that's how I got involved in the scandal. I wasn't involved in that case. Occasionally, I would hear on the radio, like one of the agents in the group would want to do a car stop and be told, no, let it go, or, we'll pick it up later, which was unusual. But I never in a million years thought that they were letting guns ride off into the sunset. So that's what Fast and Furious basically was a case where instead of doing what cops do, pulling over cars, asking probative questions, seizing firearms, figuring out who else is in the car, they were up on wiretaps and they watched these transactions take place and they documented what they saw and they let the guns go so they could trace them later. In fact, there was one deal, and again, I wasn't involved in the case, but I'd hear about it, where the traffickers were at the Scottsdale Gun Club, which was a dealer who we work with often, stand up, great place, honest place. The dealers observed the ATF folks surveilling them, right? So they called the police thinking that they were going to get robbed, right? Because dishonest people assume, I guess, that. So they didn't think it was ATF. They thought it was criminals. So the Scottsdale police responded to the scene and had no idea because ATF didn't tell them, hey, we're here, surveillance. Scottsdale police gave them an escort from the scene, the traffickers, because ATF didn't tell Scottsdale police what they were doing. It's a complete mess. That's just one of many of these, surveillances where things would happen. And instead of doing what cops do, they just documented and, continued to build the case without any focus on public safety or, hey, one of those guns that you're not stopping can kill a cop somewhere. And Brian Terry turned out to be an example of just that.
Yeah, and that's extremely disheartening and sad to hear that and hear you explain that. So you, as a supervisor in ATF and as just a law enforcement professional, just how frustrated did that make you?
Incredibly. Look, I was
Yeah.
frustrated to begin with because of the lack of prosecutions. Because what a lot of folks don't realize, the public, you realize, is to be a good cop and especially at the investigative level where you're doing stuff, you need subpoenas, you need court orders at times, you need to take somebody out of prison, so you need a court order to have him point out addresses where he did robberies. I mean, you need lawyers for that. I was very blessed to work with some great lawyers in New York, and I worked on these cases that exceeded my dreams about what I would be able to work on. So then when I came to Phoenix, I would watch my agents constantly running into a wall because when they would need something like a subpoena or a court order, sometimes you'd be, well, there's other ways of doing it. Hey, instead of sitting there and typing something out and going to a grand jury and swearing it out, you're going to say no. So I watched my agents struggle and I realized that they'll never reach their full potential, not because of anything that they're doing, but because we didn't have that buy-in from the prosecutors. So by the time that Brian Terry passed and John Dodson blew the whistle and I learned what was actually happening in that group, I was actually quite frustrated because I felt bad. I felt bad for my team because they were good agents trying to be better agents, but they couldn't get that partnership that I had in New York because I worked with lawyers who actually were just eager to do the job, where it was kind of a cultural laziness when I got to Phoenix. It was mind-blowing.
So what was your thought process when you said, you know what, this is what's right, and this is what I need to do, because we all know right and wrong, right? And we all should be living our lives, with integrity and, above reproach. So, when you made that decision, did you care? Like, you know what? I don't even care what comes down the line. This is what's right, and this is what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, I kind of got to that point because look, I mean, we were trying. We went to the state attorney's office, like I told you. We were trying to do things, but at some point, you realize that if you're not going to talk about something, then you can't fix that something. And that something was the culture of federal law enforcement in Phoenix. So I mean, look, my agents didn't do anything as nearly as messed up as Fast and Furious. We did our best to seize guns without violating anybody's rights. Look, there were times where we'd pull somebody over. I'll give you an example. There were times where we'd follow a trafficker, and the traffickers weren't stupid. They would go from one dealer to another dealer. They would also call people on Craigslist who were selling firearms. So there were times where we'd watch a transaction happen in a parking lot. We'd follow the trafficker away, and then we would stop the seller and we would ask him questions. And more often than not, it was just an honest person who was like, "Hey, I was trying to sell the gun." He answered the ad. It's not against the law to sell a firearm if it's a personally owned firearm that you're selling as a private sale. So, I mean, we would just, okay, well, you'll be a good witness. So we never went and arrested those folks because there was really nothing to charge them with. So we treated them with respect. But I mean, what I was seeing happen out in Phoenix was just, it was mind blowing. It went against everything I believed in law enforcement. And again, this didn't just affect ATF because I worked a lot with the marshals, with Homeland Security investigations. Back then, they were all ICE. And they were dealing with the same headaches. So, like, how is this good for the public? How is this protecting the public in Arizona? So I kind of felt like I really had no choice but to speak up. But it's funny because the day I did speak up, I actually had a conversation with an agent who blew the whistle on some other stuff that happened in ATF prior to that, not something as publicly known. And he told me, he said, "Pete, you're going to be a marked man." And he was right. I mean, it took me like years of fighting to get my reputation cleared because the DOJ, even up until the day we had the public hearing, that was June 15th of 2011, they were denying that guns walked. I mean, they were basically calling the whistleblowers liars, which we proved was not the case. They walked over 2,000 guns in that case.
So just a lot of dynamics. I mean, you going from New York to Phoenix, and then you ended up in Miami after that. Was that correct?
Well, after Fast and Furious, I got thrown out because what happened is, as the group supervisor, my job would be, in addition to running my team in Phoenix, and I had some agents in Yuma that I supervised as well. As your job is to be the intermediary with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Well, I blew the whistle on the U.S. Attorney's Office big time, and so I could no longer work with them. So I kind of had to leave the state of Arizona because they were the only federal game in town. It's like in New York, because it is the Eastern District of New York and the Southern District. One's in Manhattan, one's in Brooklyn. So if one of them's mad at you, you can drive across the river in more cases there. In Arizona, they didn't have that opportunity. So I went to headquarters for a few months, wrote policy, which sucked. I'm not a policy guy. Then I was sent up to Canada for 2 years, where I was a liaison to Eastern Canada. Great cops up in Canada,
Mm.
awesome, awesome people. Loved it. Great assignment. Then I came back and I was in headquarters as the chief of the Leadership Professional Development Division for a while, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. Here I was blowing the whistle on leadership, and then I go up to Canada for a couple of years, and then they put me in charge of leadership training. So certainly a different outcome than most whistleblowers face, I think. But uh, from when I blew the whistle up until that time, man, it was a all-out brawl between me and the
I'm
DOJ
sure.
and the OIG. But yeah, after that position, I was sent down to Miami, and I spent a few years down there as the number 2 in charge of the office. I'm sorry. And then finally as the head of the office, which was a great experience.
And the funny thing is, so you say that they end up put you in charge of the leadership, but not only that, but then they send you to headquarters to write policy. I find that very interesting as well.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just from what you saw, and then going there and being put in that position, did that give you an opportunity to put any policies in place that kind of helped, alleviate some of that stuff you saw go on, or was that more of a formality?
Well, what happened was the person when Fast and Furious happened, they wiped out the entire command staff at a Phoenix Field Division. They were just removed. I'm sorry. A gentleman named Tom Brandon came in to temporarily be the head of the Phoenix Field Division. I had never met him. He came in and wanted to know what was going on there, and I was Phoenix Group 1. So, I mean, there were 7 groups. I was the first person to brief him. We did it in numerical order. So I laid everything on the table. I had nothing to hide. I think he appreciated that honesty. So much later, he actually rose to the level of being the deputy director. So by the time I came back from Canada, I think he respected the fact that that I didn't lie, I didn't fudge anything. I was honest, put everything on the table. So I think that's why he put me in those positions. But yeah, I mean, my goal was and remained up until the end to do things to make sure that a Fast and Furious would never happen again. So, and look, the reality is it all came down to sticking to the basics. Like you have your football coaches, fundamentals, the fundamentals.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they did. They abandoned the fundamentals of law, normal police tactics in that Fast and Furious investigation. So we basically just returned to the fundamentals and stuck with them and trained to them. So that's what they empowered me to do. So that's what I did.
Yeah. So as you kind of made your transition and you started getting towards the end of your career and you were kind of being put in, those leadership positions, and as you look back on that, what is a good leadership standpoint that you fall into, that you're like, hey, this is the way it needs to be done. This is the way other people should be doing it, because I'm watching all of this stuff unfold that I've been a part of, and this is just good quality leadership. What does that look like for you?
Do the right thing, right? Look, managers do things right. Leaders do the right thing. You got to factor into the mission is very important, but so are your people. And I've seen some managers who steamroll their people. Some of it's because they lead by title. I was blessed to work over the years for some amazing leaders. And what I try to do is just try to steal like all of the good qualities from them. And look, you learn a lot from the bad leaders too. So I tried to cast those aside and just tried to be the best leader that I could be, recognizing that I don't know everything, and I made mistakes and people forgave me for those mistakes. So I wanted to treat my people the same way. Like I only once, I was a supervisor from 2007 till I retired in 2021. Only once did I actually write up an employee for misconduct. Usually there was punishment that didn't go into their record because they weren't mistakes of the mind. They were honest mistakes that they didn't think. Like, to give you an example, I had an agent one time, we were doing search warrants, and he was in a black outfit, black vest, didn't say police on it, with his M4 with a balaclava mask on, standing on school grounds, doing perimeter for a house across the street. So, ATF policy, you're not allowed to wear a balaclava unless you have the special agent in charge's permission. He didn't. But I was just like so taken aback by his poor judgment to be standing on school grounds dressed like that. that I had a conversation with him, and instead of saying, "Hey, boss, I'm sorry," he come, "Well, I do a lot of undercover. You don't understand." So what happened was I said, I could have wrote him up, but he was a good agent. He
Yeah.
just had a momentary lapse in reason. So I said, "Look, here's what you're going to do. You're going to come into division in a suit, and you're going to answer phones for 2 weeks." So I had him come in. About a week into it, I could see he was just like, he bottomed out, man. He was
Yeah.
depressed. So I called him in my office. I said, "Hey, man," and I want to mention his name. You understand what you did wrong now? "Yes, sir." And he was genuinely sorry for what he did. He learned his
Yeah.
lessons. "Okay, go back to your group." And he went back and worked cases. So he didn't even get the full 2 weeks punishment. But I felt like he got the message.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, I thought was important to do instead of, hurting people for honest mistakes. But yeah, when they did something bad, I would hold them to account. But never would looking to punish somebody for making a mistake that was honest. Because look, I've made plenty, and I still make plenty, and that's part of the profession. Look, anybody who thinks that policing is always going to get it right is always going to be disappointed, because we're a profession of human beings.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. So at what point, and because I want to make sure we talk about this, at what point did you decide to kind of put all of your, your career, all of your experiences into a book? Right.
Well,
So
the book isn't about my whole career. It's about what happened when I got to Phoenix, and then I touch on what happened afterwards, because I think it's important to hold people accountable, but also to give credit to the folks there, because there were some folks in ATF chain of command who did the right thing. I mean, it would have been easy for them to just kind of put their hands up and say, let's watch Pete get filleted. But they didn't do that. So they didn't necessarily fight for me, but they empowered me to fight for myself. I don't know if that makes any sense. So I wrote about the Fast and Furious thing for two reasons. Well, three. One is because I had a shit ton of lawyers' bills, and it would be nice if I could make some of that money back. But the reality is, the lawyers that made a lot of the decisions in Operation Fast and Furious were never held accountable. They skirted any responsibility, because the agents, for the most part, took it on the chin. And look, there are some people in ATF that were disciplined that absolutely deserved it. Some who deserved it weren't. So I wanted to set the record straight, because I would see new agents coming in. This is reason number three. And you know how it is. Some people are just happy to have a job. They show up, they'll do all the push-ups, the sit-ups, they do it. But then you get somebody who, like, every now and then, like, "Hey, I was researching ATF, and I saw you're a whistleblower." And first they seemed shocked that I was still employed by ATF, and I was probably just as shocked as they were. But so they would ask, like, did we ever do that? And because they got the impression that ATF as a whole was sending guns down to Mexico or whatever, because no one ever told the real story. In fact, we had talked about doing like an after action training, like lessons learned. And we were always told, no, the lawyers won't allow you to do that. We don't talk about Fast and Furious. So my thing was setting the record straight for these younger agents, or for agents who were in other field divisions that don't know what was happening in Phoenix. So they'll know, because I mean, the old saying, those who don't know history are bound to repeat it, and something like that can never happen again. So I wanted to hold the folks that weren't accountable, and I name names in the book. The names are the names. And I just wanted to set the record straight so that people could see what happened, so that it doesn't happen again. Because again, the whole impetus for this was the abandonment of what cops do every single day.
Yeah.
And it was really didn't make any sense.
Yeah, and if somebody's interested in getting your book or purchasing your book, so it's The Deadly Path, and where can they find it?
It's available for pre-order now on Amazon. It's going to be on the shelves March 5th. And like I said, it's just an honest account of what happened out there. Because back in those days, you heard if you watch Fox News, you heard the Republican version, which was blame Obama. If you watch CNN, it was no, it started under Bush, blame Bush. The real story has never been told about what happened there. John Dodson did write a book, but it focused on what happened in that group. But it didn't focus on the bigger picture of what was happening in Phoenix beyond, that initial investigation itself. Because there's a reason it's called The Deadly Path. It's because prosecutors paved the path that got us there, and I explicitly lay out how that path was paved.
So how long did it take you to kind of compile all the information you put in the book?
Not long, because I had court documents, I had information from when I testified in front of Congress. There were depositions in front of Congress before there was a televised hearing. So I had access to a lot of that stuff. And I held on to those things because, like I said, I spent 4 years trying to clear my name because I was accused of perjury and several other things.
Yeah.
So, so it kind of made it easy. I don't say it was cut and pasted, but, as far as the timeline, it was all there already. So it was just a matter of putting the information together. So I wrote a 174,000 word manuscript, which was way too long. And a co-author, Kate McGregor, she took it and made it much more manageable and made it read a lot less like a long, boring police report.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's good. So as we kind of start to wind down, looking back on, just your time with ATF and with those that are, that are in the career right now in law enforcement that come up against some of these challenges that you face, right? Where it's like they're kind of put up against, hey, this is what's right? This is the right decision. This isn't how, police work should be done. And, just seeing you and seeing just even after that, how well your career was still successful, right? You still had a successful career. You still, thrived. You still, got to a position of prominence, right? So what would you encourage those who, might be in the same place you were at that time?
well, a couple things. Number one is the only thing that you leave the job with is your reputation, right? So don't let anybody attack your reputation. Stand up for yourself when you're right. And when you're wrong, admit when you're wrong. And in the book, I made mistakes. There's some things you'll see in that book. It's like, oh, wow, okay, this guy laid it on the table. He could have did something better. And I explain that. So own your mistakes, but stand up for your reputation, number one. And look, when I blew the whistle on Fast and Furious, it never became me versus ATF. And some of the whistleblowers kind of took this position like it was them versus the organization. For me, it was like, I just want to talk about the problem. And I know I basically went back to work and I worked my ass off. So I didn't spend all that time. I coached one of the whistleblowers to try to get him out of that funk. I was like, hey, man, you're like this all the time. You know what I mean? So the agency sees you like this. You think that you got your hands up because you're defending yourself. They think you want to fight. So stop with that posture and just go there and prove yourself through your work. And he didn't want to do that. Like he was too busy just fighting, poking the bear and then getting mad when the bear growled back at him.
Yeah.
So I would just say, if you see something out there that's wrong, speak up about it. But don't make it you versus the organization. Make it you versus the problem and come with solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think for anybody, and it doesn't matter if it's law enforcement or any career, I think that there's this expectancy or there's a lack of expectancy for people to be accountable, right? To be accountable to not only the bad decisions, but also the good decisions they make and following through with what you know to be wrong and right. Following through with just, hey, this is the way it is. This is how it should be done. But then also having accountability when you say, yeah, you know what? You're right. I was wrong in that and I need to do better next time. And like I said, I think that's lacking. I think it's lacking across the board, not just in law enforcement, but just in general. Nobody wants to take ownership for anything anymore. And I think that probably went a long way with you. Just like, hey, look, this is what I see. This is the problem, but it's not going to affect the effort that I put into the job, right? So you still came in and you still put in that 100% effort, right? You were still very much dedicated to your work and your job and the profession in general and just wanting to do good law enforcement work. And that goes a long way. And eventually, who you are as an individual is going to come out.
Right.
So, people are going to say whatever they want to say. People can have perceptions of you and they can say and think and go around and tell everybody. But if you maintain who you are, eventually that part of you is going to be told. It may take a couple of years, but people are going to see and they're going to realize, you know what? Pete, he's a good dude. Yeah, you know what? He may have brought us to the attention of this, but on the backside of it, he's a good worker. He's a good supervisor. He's a good agent. He's a good lawman. So, yeah, this is where we're at.
Yeah. Hey, look, when you raise your hand, you take an oath. Like I took the oath. I took it as a New York City cop. Then when we merged, I took it again. Then when I left and went to ATF, I took it again. Down at the academy, when we would swear in new classes, I would raise my hand and recite the oath with them. Nowhere in that oath does it say that the name of a police chief or the name of a mayor or the name of a president or an attorney general. You're basically giving your word to the people. So that's, to me, that's your word is who you are, So do your best to keep your word to the people. And look, you're not always going to get it right. Accept that. Mistakes are great learning opportunities. So God knows I've learned a lot from my mistakes, and I've learned a lot from other people's mistakes too. So going back to the thing about, asking for help, I hope some of your listeners will learn from my mistakes, because I lost a lot of really quality time with my wife and kids that I would have had I asked for help many, many years earlier. So, but yeah, just be the best person you could be, and that'll make you a good cop. We're human beings,
Yeah, absolutely. So, and as we close, I just, want to hit you with one more thing is as you look back over your career and, and just everything you've kind of walked through and the upcoming release of your book, as looking back over your faith, how much has that played into where you're at today?
Faith, a lot, because, look, I was raised Roman Catholic, but I've kind of been distant from the church, but not distant from God. It's important to realize that we serve higher powers than ourselves, and at some point, look, we're judged here, right? But then we're judged later. So I pray to God. When I was sick, I prayed to God. Again, don't necessarily agree with some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, but that's a church. That's not the man above. So I think it's important. Spirituality is important. And going back to what I said, look, I'm Roman Catholic, but the person who helped me preach meditation. He was more into Buddhism than some of the other stuff that I, worshiped growing up. So, I mean, just to have something, a sense of purpose of a bigger thing than yourself, I think is just critically important.
Yeah. And I've talked about that, recently is that's a kind of a factor that, is getting kind of lost, right? There's the stigma change, right? Where it's getting more common to talk about the mental and the emotional side of the law enforcement profession. But I think there's kind of that lack of actually jumping into the spiritual component of that, and how much the profession really takes a toll on you as an individual and just your overall spirituality. So, but no, I'm glad you're able to share that, but I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you taking the time, and I can, if you're willing, I can share, some of your information in the show notes if you want that, just if anybody wants to connect with you via, social media or anything like that. And then, like you said, your book will be available. You said March 5th. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can pre-order it now, but it'll be on the shelves March 5th.
All right.
Yeah, no. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so I just joined Facebook to market the book, but I was never on Facebook. So yeah, I'll send you the links, and this way you can share it with your viewers. And look, I believe it in my heart. I'm still that kid that walked the beat in the Bronx. I'm a cop at heart, so if I can help another cop, I'm happy to do it.
Absolutely. So, well, I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate the time, and I appreciate what you're doing. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Honored to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I appreciate you tuning in and listening to Critical Aspects of Law Enforcement. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and share this resource with your fellow officers. The goal of Critical Aspects is to serve, support, and sustain the law enforcement professionals. So head over to www.criticalaspects.org for more resources and information. And as always, God bless and be safe.